Well, this week, a Georgia special prosecutor announced charges would be dropped against two white Atlanta police officers who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks in 2020. Now, the prosecutor says the officers, Garrett Rolfe and Devin Brosnan, acted reasonably when 27-year-old Brooks lunged and grabbed one of their tasers during an attempted arrest. Officer Rolfe, who shot at Brooks, had been charged with felony murder. Now, Brooks was killed shortly after the death of George Floyd, and that set off a new round of protests against police brutality and racial injustice. For more on this, I want to bring in Lance LoRusso. He's the attorney for Officer Garrett Rolfe. And we also want to note that CBS News reached out to the attorneys representing Rayshard Brooks, but we did not receive a response. Lance, thanks for joining us. How was the decision made to drop the charges against both officers?
With a great deal of investigation. The prosecutors followed the law. The original investigation prior to the charges took 5 days. The GBI, which is an independent investigation, took 130 days. And the prosecutor that was appointed by the Attorney General's office took probably 18 or 20 months. So this was very thoroughly investigated using outside experts.
And of course, it was all on video, several angles of this entire incident caught on tape. Can you talk about the law behind the use of deadly force and how it applies to this case?
Sure. So Georgia law is very similar to the law in other states. Matter of fact, we've looked at about 44 states. I've represented about 150 officers or more who have been involved in shootings. So generally, you're talking about a reasonable belief standard, whether the officer reasonably believes that a person poses a deadly threat or is committing a forcible felony. And in this case, it's Georgia Code 17-4-20. And it allows an officer to use deadly force if they believe a person has committed a forcible felony, is committing a forcible felony at the time involving serious injury or death, if the person is still armed and creating a threat to the public. And essentially, in the pictures that you're seeing here, Mr. Brooks they had probable cause to believe he was under arrest for DUI. And at that point, he escalated the situation, violently attacking two law enforcement officers. As the prosecutors found, he stole one taser and discharged the taser at point blank into Officer Devin Brosnan's face. He's also my client. And then was running, basically armed, reached back and fired the taser at Officer Rolfe. And at that point, he was justified in using deadly force.
So it does sound like it fits the letter of the law there. But when Brooks turned back and fired that second shot in the taser, it was the last shot in the taser, so there was nothing left. The officers must have known that. So the question is, did Officer Rolfe have to shoot Brooks after his life was no longer in danger? Were there other options?
Well, the question is exactly what you just asked. Obviously, there were no more shots in the taser. Obviously, the officers knew that. That has absolutely not been established and is contradicted by all of the evidence. This took place very, very quickly, very rapidly. And for an officer in the middle of the night, after being struck, and you can see in that picture that Garrett Rolfe actually still has marks on his face. He was struck very violently by Rayshard Brooks. Devin Brosnan had a concussion. To hold them responsible to find out what we now know is completely unreasonable. And for the officer to make that decision in a fraction of a second is just not reasonable.
Yeah, it is a split-second decision, and now we get to analyze it frame by frame from every single angle over and over and over again. Prosecutors are now saying they're going to move to vacate all charges against the two officers, and lawyers for the Brooks family say they plan to file a civil lawsuit against the officers. What do you see happening here?
The prosecutors have already vacated the charges, and the family has already filed a lawsuit. They filed a lawsuit several months ago, and the attorneys for Garrett Rolfe and Devin Brosnan have moved to dismiss it. This was not even a close call at the time. There was plenty of video as to what happened, and the law has not changed. The law was very clear. The only game changer in this from an arrest, a DUI arrest that happens thousands of times across the United States, where the only application of force is handcuffs. The only thing that changed that dynamic was Rayshard Brooks. He was on probation. He didn't want to go back to jail.
Lance LoRusso, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.